Hey, all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So remember, due by tomorrow, the 10th, is that you need to turn in your factory simulation reflection questions alternative assignment. So like I said, you could either try to complete that factory simulation at home and answer the reflection questions, or you're going to fast forward in the video I posted, watch part of it, and answer those questions, try to gain experience. I guess not an experience, try to gain an insight into what it would have been like to be a factory worker compared to a wealthy person at that point in history. And then also you should have watched the lecture on immigration and urbanization and racism and completed that exit slip where you'd write down 5 facts in that Google Doc. So in today's class, we pretty much finished up the book work for chapter 5 and 6, so make sure that you did that. Altogether, there were only 3 assignments that we ended up doing. For page 221, we just did number 1, not 1 and 2. And we ended up skipping page 201. So I kind of modified it from where we were earlier in the year. So feel free to go back and look at that bookwork assignment that's posted, but you'll need to get that done by Wednesday. You're also going to have 10 review questions due Wednesday as well. So make sure you're doing those to help kind of prep for the test later this week. And then also don't forget, you've got that Gilded Age dinner party mini project that's due. Right now I've got it due as Thursday, Friday of this week, but I'm starting to think about maybe extending that due date. I feel like kids might be a little bit stressed at the moment, so I might extend that due date. I didn't want it hanging over your heads with the test at the same time, but if you guys have feedback on that, I'd love to hear it. If you want me to extend that due date into next week, I can. I just wanted to have that mini project due so then you could focus on the test next weekend. But if you think the extra time will help, shoot me an email and then I'll probably change that due date for everybody. We're also going to go back to watching President Notes this week because this last part of the chapter, today's lecture and then the last lecture that I'll post on Wednesday, and there'll be another exit slip that goes along with it, it's all about politics. And so we'll go back to watching the President video clips this week as well. We'll have some to watch on the remote day that kids are watching at home, and we have some to watch in class. And I'd love to see you guys at a Google Meet either Tuesday or Friday of this week at 2:30. So the reason we're kind of, that's just kind of an overview of what's going on this week, since some of you have not seen your faces at all, and I have no idea if you're listening to this, but we can hope. So the rest of the stuff that I'm talking about today and Wednesday is about politics. So basically about the government leaders of the Gilded Age, the policies that they pass, the laws that are in place. And what you see in front of you are, these are the 6 major presidents of the Gilded Age, which remember goes from roughly about 1870 to about 1904, to something like that. A lot of people, though, would say that this man, Rutherford B. Hayes, is the first Gilded Age president. Other people would argue that President Grant was the first Gilded Age president. Grant was in office, and it's going to be his office that is kind of troubled with all sorts of scandals. That it turns out there's the credit mobilia scandal, there's the whiskey ring scandal. It seems like members of his cabinet were taking bribes, they were doing things to make money, and if they're allowing, industrialist robber barons to influence them, that is definitely political corruption. A robber baron cannot just pay a politician to vote a certain way just so they can get their way and make more money. That's graft, that's political corruption. And we know it definitely was happening with Grant, but Reconstruction is really still also going on in America at that time, Western expansion, so we kind of just focus on Hayes as being our first real Gilded Age president. Now, you've heard of Hayes before. We talked about him when we was talking about Reconstruction, the Civil War, and we said that he was the president that came to power and basically ended Reconstruction. It was another highly disputed election. I know you guys are young, you haven't been alive yet during a lot of elections, but trust me, they're all highly disputed and, a big deal. That's not the case. There's a few that are not, but in general, it's always very dramatic with lots going on. And when Hayes basically got elected, he won the Electoral College no problem. Nobody in the South voted for him. And people were worried it was going to be a repeat of 1860, that the South would somehow try to rebel again and secede, which was not going to happen. There might have been big talkers, but they didn't have any kind of military presence. They had learned their lesson. They had not, rebuilt enough. They didn't want another war. So the South, though, said, we're not going to fight. We're going to accept this man as our president, but in return, we want something. We want Reconstruction over. We want the U.S. military to leave the South for there no longer to be 5 zones for us to be babysat. And that happens. And the South then kind of feels like they're part of the country again and they can be trusted, but in reality, they shouldn't have been trusted. What ends up happening is that many whites who'd been involved in the government prior to the Civil War take power again. They redeem the South. Many of them are incredibly racist in their views. They can't bring back slavery, but instead they bring back, a new form of slavery with separated, race laws, segregation laws known as Jim Crow laws. And so, unfortunately, he kind of brings about the end of equality in America. I mean, you can't blame one man entirely, but he allows it to really happen. And, it's really going to hurt the lives of many African Americans for years to come. But he definitely kind of signals a change in a phase in America. And also industrialization really continues. More people are going to be moving to the cities, many African Americans will, because they don't want to be in the South during this time period, as the KKK is going to be rising from the ashes and increasing their vigilante efforts towards African Americans who are trying to practice the rights that have been given to them, such as the right to vote. James Garfield, if you're looking at his picture, you're going to notice it only has 1 year. I'll be posting a comment on Wednesday about how you should be watching Hayes' president's video clip and writing down 5 facts. The same with Garfield. Garfield, you're going to be learning more about this week, is only in office for a short time. He's going to be murdered by a man by the name of Charles Guiteau, who's a disgruntled office seeker. He basically thought he deserved a job because he voted for Garfield. And you might say that sounds ridiculous. Well, it was more complicated than that. The man also wanted to see Chester A. Arthur, the vice president, to be in office next. The man obviously had some emotional, mental health issues going on. But there really was a system of patronage back then, where if you supported someone in this corrupt time, you thought you could basically get a job or buy someone off, and your money went quite a long ways. Chester A. Arthur, who was kind of corrupt and shady and had some very influential friends, was very focused on wealth and image. No one ever foresaw him as president. Actually didn't turn out to be a terrible president. Finishes out Garfield's term and passes some important laws like the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which focus on how we need to reform the government and people need to take a test to get government jobs. They shouldn't just be getting a job because they voted for someone or a member of their political party or family or something like that. Grover Cleveland is the only Democrat in the group. The vast majority of the Gilded Age, pretty much all of the Gilded Age, you see Republican presidents in power. And when we talk about Republican and Democrat as far as those labels of political parties, the things that they believed 100 years ago are not the same views that they have today, and they don't necessarily have the same supporters. But during this era, at least, the Democrats were associated with the South and with racism, and the Republicans were like the party of Lincoln and change. As I said, those aren't necessarily true statements today, but at that point in history it kind of was, which is why no one really was voting Democrat. It was kind of the old racist party of the South. And all of these presidents are Republican, except for Grover Cleveland. And so that's why he's one, person to take note of. And he does win the presidential election. He is an unusual president who is considered himself to be a Democrat, but he focuses on industrialization and laissez-faire capitalism, trying to let businesses do what they're supposed to do. But he doesn't have quite the same views as far as taxation with other countries or taxes as some of the other presidents. He loses his re-election bid to a man by the name of Benjamin Harrison. And then Benjamin Harrison only serves one term, and then Grover Cleveland comes back. Grover Cleveland had kind of a scandalous first term in office. He ends up getting married. Him and his wife have a daughter named Baby Ruth. The candy bar is named after her. And you might remember him because he was the president during the Pullman strikes, who sent in the military to put down those strikes. So America is expanding during this time overseas. They're doing trade. Most of these presidents do not support labor unions or worker rights, and the economy is booming. And then the president that comes after Cleveland, the big election of 1896, is going to be all about William McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan, and I'll talk more about that one on Wednesday. So you're going to be watching the president clips, though, Hayes and Garfield on Wednesday, and later this week in class I'll be showing the kids some more, and we'll be watching the rest into the next chapter as we kind of catch up to where we should be in history with these different Gilded Age presidents and the laws they've passed. So what we're going to do now, as we've kind of talked a little bit each about who these presidents are during this time, is I want to talk about dividing up the country into the North, the South, and the West. And today I'm just going to start off by talking about what life was like in the South during the Gilded Age in terms of politics and governments and laws and leaders and things like that. And I'll do a little bit about what was happening in the North. And then in Wednesday's lecture, I'll wrap up talking about things in the North, and then I'll kind of move to kind of a review in the West. Now, this part right here is honestly going to seem like review. And remember, these are your notes. If you don't want to write any of this down, that's fine. I'll post this stuff later this week on Google Classroom. But during this whole time period of the Gilded Age, we basically see, remember, the end of Reconstruction kind of beginning once Hayes is elected and those troops leave the South. And as I mentioned, those Redeemers, the Democrats, are going to take power in the government in the South. And they're going to be passing laws that create segregation, that create separation of the races, saying this is where blacks go, this is where whites go, in terms of bathrooms, restaurants, having blacks sit at, of course, the back of the bus, which is probably something you're familiar with from learning about Rosa Parks when you were younger. So there are these segregation laws, and they become known as Jim Crow laws. During this time period, one of the popular forms of entertainment was vaudeville, which almost has like a lot of skits in it, and also ragtime, has a lot of like piano music in it, and it's kind of has some jazz-like elements. And as people watched these different shows down south, one of the popular characters was this Jim Crow. They made African Americans look very stupid and had a lot of cheap jokes at the expense of this character, Jim Crow, and always made him look dumb. And so as they created these segregation laws that separated the races, they naturally named them Jim Crow, who was kind of, almost a folk hero to some of these people who were incredibly biased with their views. So that's basically kind of how these Jim Crow laws come about. And African Americans will be incredibly mistreated, and there'll be a bias against them. And whites, want these laws in place because they're unhappy that they lost the Civil War and that slavery is over, and this is the best they can do in this situation. Now, some African Americans try to fight back, and they're like, all right, these laws are morally wrong. I'm going to run for office. I'm going to get them changed at the state or federal level. Well, first problem was most African Americans who had run earlier in Reconstruction, like Hiram Revels, being the first black senator, they don't run again. Because now that we see the KKK is back in power, you will get attached, you'll have someone burn a cross in your front yard, you'll be lynched, you'll be hung, which was not considered like a terrible crime, as they hung African Americans from trees. I mean, this is murder, yet there were no true anti-lynching laws. It wasn't considered a hate crime or anything like that. And if someone was even arrested, like even if the case was investigated, most of the time the local police were corrupt or racist, and they'd say, oh, we don't have any suspects, no one would get arrested. And if someone was, they often would be cleared of all charges by the jury. They wouldn't face any jail time for these heinous crimes. So many African Americans basically figure, okay, I'm not going to run for office. Some tried to change the system by voting. But remember, during this time period, this is when the southern states put in poll taxes where you have to pay to vote, literacy tests where you have to prove that you can pass a reading comprehension test to vote. And it's not just like Bob ran. Okay, it's very complicated. And whites had to pass the same test, but then they also came out with the grandfather clause, where it said that if your grandpappy could vote in 1860, you can vote. So basically it was a free way, or a roundabout way to make sure that whites could always vote without having to pay or pass a literacy test, but it kept African Americans from voting because none of their grandparents could vote in 1860. It was ridiculous. Now, one man decided to try to challenge these laws, and his name was Homer Plessy. And Homer Plessy looked white. His identity card said he was black. He bought a train ticket. He wanted to sit in the white train car, not the black train car. There was a visible difference in the cars in terms of the quality of the fabric. The black train car had like springs sticking through. It was not very comfortable. It was hot. There were no refreshments. The list goes on. And he's able to buy the ticket, but then when he's sitting in the car, the conductor asks for his identity card, realizes that his grandparent is black, so under the law he is considered black, even though he may not look black. And even though he was already allowed to purchase the ticket, he gets scolded for trying to trick the system. Plus, he was trying to see what would happen and push the system and see if he could bring about change. And he was angry that he was being treated this way. And he gets arrested, and it goes to court, and it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, was very racist. And they said that as long as facilities are separate, but of equal quality, it's perfectly okay to have separate schools, bathrooms, restaurants for blacks and whites. And so this legalized segregation, and this will be in effect all the way till the 1950s, 1960s, where you've got Brown versus Board of Education and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And in reality, these facilities were not equal by any means. You know, they were always of poorer quality for African Americans, and they were treated terribly. Now, some other African Americans during this time period, like Booker T. Washington, tried to bring about change by creating schools for African Americans, saying the only way that blacks will get respect is if they have more money and a better education. Other African Americans, like W.E.B. Du Bois, tried to improve the system by helping create the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, to bring about change. But unfortunately, even with more schools and better education or new political organizations, segregation was going to last in America for years. And the president during this era and the state leaders did very little to change that. Many people will say during this time period that although there is a president, he's not very powerful. Many people felt like the most powerful man in the world was John D. Rockefeller, the wealthiest man in the world. And it was not the president or any of the presidents, because they were so hands-off, following not just a laissez-faire capitalism mentality in business, but just towards the American people in general. They were very hands-off. So that's kind of what's happening in the South. And so it's not so much about industrialization. Yes, major cities are getting rebuilt. Carpetbaggers from the North had come down years before, and they're trying to bring about industry and railroads. But still, much of the South is agricultural, farming-based. Many African Americans leave to go north to get jobs in factories as part of this great migration. Some become exodusters, go out west to become ranchers and cowboys and farmers under the Homestead Act, just to escape racism. But many stay because they say all they know is farming. They don't know where they would go. And so they become sharecroppers, working land for someone else, and then paying their rent in a portion of their crops. And then they kind of get stuck in this system of poverty where they're really never able to get out of it. And there were Jim Crow laws throughout the country, but these Jim Crow laws that were throughout the country were not heavily enforced in the North and some of these other regions. And especially out west, things out west were always pretty liberal in terms of change. I mean, Western states, by the time we get to the 1800s, are allowing women to vote compared to everywhere else in the nation. So they were really kind of letting people do what they wanted out west. It really was the wild, wild west in that format. But all the rest of those stereotypes, myths, really are untrue. So let's move and talk about what's happening in the North. And I'll start this part of the lecture now, and I'll finish this one on Wednesday. I'll finish at the North, and then I'll talk about the West. In the North, it's the center of industrialization, right? And we know that all these new inventions are coming out. Factories are being created to produce these inventions. Immigrants are coming to America because of push and pull factors. You know, in terms of a push factor, they're wanting to leave their home country because perhaps there's the Irish potato famine and they're starving. And in terms of a pull factor, you know, they're coming to America because they're looking for a better life, political freedom, religious freedom, economic opportunities. And of course, they're going to arrive in the cheapest way possible in steerage as they come on a boat. If they're coming along the East Coast, they're going to be processed through Ellis Island, Ellis East. That's how you keep it straight in your mind. Compared to if they're going through the West Coast and coming to like California, they'll be going through Angel Island, right? But they all have a hope for a new life. But these cities are getting very crowded very quickly. And that's where we get all those city problems related to urbanization or the growth of the cities. Well, you get all these new people into a city, you need someone to pick up the trash. You need someone to deal with the pollution and filth. There's increased crime perhaps going on, especially since there's a gap between the rich and the poor. There's not enough park districts or police stations or fire departments. And as I said, the government just really didn't realize that it was their job to provide people with services. And so since the state, local, federal government was not doing their job, basically, this new organization was created called the political machine. And it will be the political machine that provides, African Americans who moved to the North to get a better life, or immigrants coming to America for a fresh start, they'll be providing them with services, as well as services to the people who lived in the cities for years. Now, the political machine, what is it? Well, you understand like what a pencil sharpener is. It's a machine, and its job is to sharpen pencils. A toaster's job is to make toast, to make that bread hot. A political machine's job is to get the candidate elected, no matter what. So when it comes to a political machine, they will have someone who's in charge of that machine for their city. So it's considered the political boss or the party boss. And they're the one who's really in control of the money. They have a lot of people working for them, and they will do anything, whatever it takes. So for example, if I was the party boss in the political machine and I was trying to get, I don't know, Mrs. Brewer elected, to become the mayor of New York City, I would hire people who would go and stand at the boats and at the docks, so that as people got off the boats and got out of steerage and came to New York City, the people that I would hire would be passing out buttons that would say things like, "Vote for Mrs. Brewer for mayor," or whoever it would be. And you would want to hit up immigrants because they don't have a political party. They don't even know what the words Republican and Democrat stand for. So you're going to basically get those people and get them to vote for your candidate. And you would offer them things like, "I'll watch your kid for an hour. I'll show you where the best jobs are. I'll show you where the apartments are that you can afford and that aren't complete dumps." And so they're basically offering things to people, and not just immigrants. It could be anybody in the community. They could offer to repave roads, to get a job, whatever people needed, the political machine would get for them, not the local government. And the political machine, would be doing it. Now, in a sense, it is the local government because, really and truly, the political machine eventually gets their candidate elected. But still, they would be getting whatever service they needed early, trash pickup, a job, you name it, some kind of health care, money to go to a doctor, whatever it is that they needed, they would be getting from this political party, and in return, they would be getting their vote. So they'll do anything to get their candidate elected. And when we talk about doing anything to get their candidate elected, we mean anything. And so we're talking about election fraud here. There are stories and reports and images which suggest that they would hire a man who had these crazy, back then it was very common to have crazy sideburns and, a beard and a mustache. They would hire him to go and vote once, and he would perhaps show up to the polls with a wife and 4 kids that would be very distracting to the poll takers. And he would go at a very busy time to vote. And then they would have him shave off his beard so he only had his mustache, and now he'd come back with a hat and a different outfit, and maybe with a little old lady and an accent and dressed totally differently. Now maybe he's in farm clothes, and before he looked like a businessman. And yet again, have him go to a different person and have him vote again. So that's fraud. You're faking election results. You're voting more than once, which you absolutely cannot do. Now, it would be very hard to do so. They scan your driver's license, they know who you are, they mark it off. Back then, it was very easy to do. There were no records, there were no way to, do anything like that, or no way to keep track of who really was voting or who wasn't. They would just make up the name of someone down the street. Now, there's all sorts of charges, of course, in our current election that fraud has occurred, but there's no actual hard evidence of fraud. President Trump has tweeted that fraud has occurred in an election. He's tweeted that out of anger. But the actual lawsuits, which his lawyers are filing, don't actually talk about fraud. They talk about just recounting the ballots pretty much for now, and the access to polling places and things like that. So it's not like fraud, even though he may say that out of anger. He hasn't really claimed or has any hard evidence to claim that anyone has voted more than once or faked the election results per se. So ultimately, though, the political machine would do whatever it took to get their candidate elected. And the idea is that once this candidate is elected, so for example, going back to Mrs. Brewer, if I got, her elected and she became the mayor of New York City, what now happens is a lot of sneaky stuff happens. So, if poor Mrs. Brewer, she doesn't know I'm picking on her at the moment, but if Mrs. Brewer was to be the mayor of New York City, what would basically happen at this point is that perhaps there would be some thing come up where they decided to redo the roads in New York, and they estimated it was going to cost, I don't know, $1 million to redo all the roads. She would find basically a shady construction company owner who would be suggested to her by me, by the head of the political machine, me as a party boss, and I would say, okay, you two make a deal. They would actually charge the American people $2 million to redo the roads. Of course, average citizens are paying for that out of their pockets, right, with increased taxes to pay for these, repaved roads. And the $1 million would go to this person who owned the construction company with maybe a little extra, $100,000, maybe to keep their mouths quiet. But then there'd be a kickback. So if, she charged $2 million, but it was really only $1 million for this project, like I said, the construction company would keep their $1 million to pay their costs. They might keep an extra $100,000, but the other $900,000 is basically a bribe of sorts. It would be kicked back to Mrs. Brewer, to the mayor. She might keep $100,000 for herself, but there's still $800,000 extra that was overcharged. And we know this because we've seen the receipts from this era where they would charge like $86,000 for like 40 chairs and 2 tables. So they're ripping people off. I mean, there's no question about it. That other $800,000 would go back to me. It would go back to the head of the political machine because I need to pay all these people who are on the payroll, including police, to look the other way. One of the most famous political machines in all of history is Tammany Hall. That's the name of the political machine out of New York City, and that party boss was a man by the name of William Boss Tweed, and he basically paid off everybody. He had everybody on the payroll. If he thought the election in any way was going to be close, he would have paid people to vote in a certain way. He would have paid to fake the overall results. So there would have been no close election, as we've seen here. If you want to fake something, if you want to pay to win, he would pay to win. It would be very clear from that beginning. So ultimately, he was a pretty corrupt guy, and he allowed anyone who worked for him to use graft to try to find ways to politically influence others, through their own personal gain. And just to wrap up today, you can see some of the political cartoons that were created by Thomas Nast, one of the famous political cartoonists of the day. Him and another journalist wrote a lot of articles about what Boss Tweed was up to. And basically you can see in that picture, like, he's way bigger than the policeman, who tends to be way bigger than that criminal. You can see everybody kind of pointing the figure about, who's in charge here and who stole the people's money. They all keep pointing to the next person, and Boss Tweed does not claim that it's him. They all think that it's somebody else. And you can see, like, instead of a face, it gives him a money bag. In a sense, he kind of looks like, a defeated king of sorts there at the bottom. So he's definitely a larger-than-life figure, incredibly wealthy, was finally exposed and had to face up to his crimes. But for a long time was able to get away with it and control people. And that's what journalists during this era were trying to do, was they were trying to expose some of this corruption. All right, guys, that's it for now. So have a great day and keep working on your stuff. Later.